For more news from a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
Why do Catholics worship Mary?
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
And a very Merry Christmas from all of us here at EWTN, the Global Catholic Network. Welcome to Call to Communion, the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, we would love to hear from you today. Here's our phone number, and that is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us in outside of North America, that is, you'll want to dial the U.S. country code and then a special phone number just for you, and that is 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And those of you watching us today on TV, you can participate as well. Here's our email address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Ryan Penny is our phone screener. Jeff Burson is on social media. If you're watching us today on YouTube or Facebook Live, you can put in your question in the comments section right there, and then Jeff will pass that on to us here in the studio. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Well, I'm great. How are you, my friend?
Oh, I'm doing decent. Thank you.
Since we're talking about Christmas, we're in the Christmas season. Why don't we do some things about, just be dealing with Christmas specifically? And one thing is that for Catholics, and many people may not realize this, it's not a one-day thing, is it?
It's not just a day. It's a season in the liturgical year. It actually stretches from Christmas Eve to Epiphany and then the baptism of our Lord.
Okay,
so several days, and so we get to keep the tree up longer.
It's a good thing.
That's a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we continue here with an email? This is from Samuel, who says, Dr. Anders, what version of the gospel do you prefer to read for the Christmas story?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I've ever considered it. I mean, among the Gospels, I've always been somewhat partial to Matthew. I mean, I really like Matthew's Gospel. Mm-hmm. But Luke is kind of endearing in its account of the Christmas story because you get all those shepherds thrown in.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, would you rather have kings or shepherds? You take your pick. And, of course, all the nativity plays that you do in school when you're growing up, you usually throw them both together. You do kind of an amalgam. When I was a kid, I think I was a king and a shepherd in different years. Yeah, so my acting career was off to a great start.
Very good.
I was also a gorilla once too, but not for a Christmas play.
I would hope not.
Yeah.
All right, Samuel, there you go. Thank you for your question. Here's one from Dominic, who says, as the new Eve, did the Blessed Virgin Mary suffer pain in giving birth to Jesus? And if not, how does the Church reconcile with this passage from Revelation 12:2, which is, she was with child and wailed aloud in pain?
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate the question. So the Church teaching is that Blessed Virgin did not have pain when she delivered the child Jesus because the birth was a miraculous birth and her virginity remained intact before, during, and after her parturition. So it was miraculous. Now, with reference to the passage in Revelation chapter 12, first of all, the identification with Mary is fairly straightforward because we're told that this woman in Revelation chapter 12 is the one who will give birth to the child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Well, the reference to the rod of iron is Psalm 2. It's a messianic psalm. It's evidently Christ the Messiah. And we know who his mommy was, right? So it's not that big a stretch. Many interpreters have also pointed out that there are elements of the description that would seem to apply maybe to the Church rather than to the Blessed Virgin Mary. A lot of our Protestant friends who reject Catholic Mariology lean to that aspect of the symbolism. Okay. Now, what Cardinal Newman pointed out a long time ago in his essays on Mary in the 19th century was yes and yes. Both and, right? But this is clearly the passage in Revelation chapter 12 is not like the gospel account and historical chronicle of the events of Jesus' birth, but is a typological depiction of the theological truths about Christ's procession, by way of, well, his incarnation, rather, I should say. And so there are elements of the description that fit to both, right? Both identifiers, both to the Virgin Mary and to the Church, which is why, by the way, the Catholic Church regards Mary as a type of the Church, right? You get both kind of realities rolled up in one in her person. And the other elements of the passage are clearly figurative and evocative. I mean, the language about dragons with tails dragging stars out of the sky is obviously not a literal description. I mean, I look up and the star's still hanging up there. I mean, it's not a literal description.
Right.
These are apocalyptic descriptions of theological realities. Now, did the Blessed Virgin herself suffer in life? Of course she did. Right, from the moment of the Annunciation, she was struck with really quite a disturbing message about what the course of her life would look like. I mean, you figure 12-year-old girl with a promise of perpetual virginity, you're betrothed to a much older man, and you learn pretty quickly that you're going to give birth to a child that everybody's going to want to hate and kill, and you have to go off into exile, live in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, come back and watch your child die the death of torture, and then have to go, live with your nephew for the rest of your days. I mean, it was a pretty serious message that she heard, and of course she did suffer. She suffered profoundly, empathetically, on behalf of her son. As any mother can tell you, you watch your child suffer and die, an ignominious death in that way. It's very painful for you. So, and then the Church, of course, does, in a metaphorical sense, suffer to bring forth Christ, insofar as Christ is birthed within each one of us as we follow in a spiritual way after Mary. And it's in that crucible of our own interior suffering that we most manifest Christ to the world.
All right. Appreciate that. Dominic, thank you so much for your email. A real quick one here before we go to break. This is from Steve on YouTube. As a convert in 2005, I jumped right in, becoming an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. I fell away from the church for several years, but now I have come home. Am I still an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. So what I would do if I were in your shoes is I would just ask your pastor what he wants you to do. I mean, when the church designates you as an extraordinary minister, it's because you've been trained and certified, and that they verify that you don't. This is not a ministry to which you have a right. It's a privilege to which you're called. Because there's an extraordinary, and that's why the word is extraordinary, need. So just talk to your pastor and say, I kind of fell off the path for a while, now I'm back. Is it okay if I continue in this ministry?
Very good.
And then there you go.
Okay. Steve, thanks for checking us out today on YouTube. In a moment here, we're going to get to Tim in Seattle, also Patrick in Albany, New York. We have a couple of lines open for you right now, and that number 833-288-EWTN for this edition of Call to Communion on EWTN. Do stay with us.
'Tis the season for Christmas programming. Join EWTN Radio Christmas Eve and Christmas Day for the 48 Hours of Christmas with the EWTN Choir and EWTN Family Christmas Special. The 48 Hours of Christmas, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day on EWTN Radio.
Father Benedict Rochelle.
I don't think people should have negative fears of God, but I think you should get a lump in your throat. You should feel excited. Suppose I was going to take you and introduce you to the Pope or to the president of some country or something. You might get a little lump in your throat. Forget it. Every day, you, I, live and move and have our being in the presence of God. These are the class of feelings we should have. And we should have them to an intense degree if we really had the sight of Almighty God. These feelings are the feelings which we shall have if we realize His presence. And in proportion as we believe that He is present, we shall have them. And not to have them is not to realize, not to believe that God is present to us.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Again, a very merry and blessed Christmas to you from all of us here at EWTN, and of course this program, Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin today with Tim. Tim is in Seattle listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hey there, Tim, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. I need your wisdom countering two pro-abortion arguments.
All right, let's hear them.
So, first, so if life truly begins at conception, then that would mean when a woman has a miscarriage, she's actually committing murder. Second,
excuse me, stop. Whoa, wait. I've never met a woman who intentionally miscarried, have you?
Of course not.
Right, that would be abortion. That'd be abortion.
Right.
So accidental miscarriage is not intentional. So how could it be murder?
Because she's getting rid of a life form out of her body.
Yeah, but not intentionally, right? I mean, murder is the crime of intentionally taking another life. And she's not intentionally taking another life, so it's not murder. It's the tragic loss.
Manslaughter?
No, it's not her fault. She's not to blame.
Okay.
Right, it's the tragic loss. I mean, she's not to blame for that any more than she would be to blame if her 5-year-old had a chromosomal disorder that led to childhood mortality. It's not her fault.
Okay. I mean, I'm certainly not arguing for abortion, but I have this conversation with abortion opponents.
Sure. So the first challenge is based on a profound misunderstanding of the nature of murder. And so that's your answer to the first problem, which is that this is not yes, a miscarriage is the loss of a human life, but it's not the crime or the sin of murder because the mother is not responsible.
And Tim, you had a second question.
Okay, so the second one, let's say I have a wart on my big toe, and that wart it has cells which are alive, but I cut it off. I'm certainly not killing any life form. So that at conception, what makes you think those cells are imbued with the spirit of life versus just being no different than a bunch of live cells?
Sure, yeah, definitely. So, question for you: will the wart on your big toe grow into an adult human?
No, it's not a proto-human.
Right, exactly. It's neither human nor is it proto-human. It does not have any intrinsic capacity to develop interiorly and internally a unique human life, but the zygote does. That's precisely the difference, right? At any stage of human development, whether you're a zygote or you're an embryo, or you're a 1-day-old child, or you're a 5-year-old child, or you're a 20-year-old man, or a 50-year-old man, or an 80-year-old man, there's always some stage of development ahead of you, some potential that you have not yet reached. But what makes you a distinct organism, a substance, in this case a rational substance, is your intrinsic ability as an organism to progress along that developmental path. And that's as true for a zygote as it is for an 80-year-old who's looking forward to his 85th birthday, right? Mm-hmm. And if anybody comes by and cuts that short intentionally, whether you do that to someone who's 85 days, or 85 hours, you're still intentionally ending a human life that has started out on its own distinct developmental pathway, and you're shutting that down. That's not true of a wart. A wart is a deformation in a distinct organism, in a human person, and the wart has no independent capacity to develop into an adult human or to trace that life path from zygote to old man.
Okay. Tim, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Let's go to Patrick now in Albany, New York, listening on Pax et Bonum Radio, AM 1460. Hey there, Patrick. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, hello. I'm just wondering about Adam. After God created Adam, the first human being. After God created Adam, it was a lifeless body until he breathed life into him. And when Jesus was dying on the cross, after he died, whose hands did he commit his spirit to? That's what I want to know.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So the phrase, into your hands I commend my spirit, is, of course, an idiomatic way of saying I surrender my soul to God. Okay? And so, we shouldn't conceive of the Almighty possessing physical hands, because God, of course, is a spirit. Now, if you're talking, however, about the Trinitarian relations, I mean, how is it if Christ is Almighty God, then how does he surrender himself to himself? I mean, that might be what you're thinking. And for that, we have to remember that the incarnate Son of God is fully God and fully human. There's one person, but two divine natures. And as a human, Christ has a human soul. And the human soul of Christ was capable of surrendering itself to Almighty God, to whom he also happened to be hypostatically united in his person. And so it's entirely appropriate to think about the person of Jesus having a spiritual life or having an interior life in the same way we would, precisely because he had a human soul. Now, it's an interior life that we could never fully imitate because we don't have the benefit of the hypostatic union. Our humanity is not joined in our person to the divinity such that you or I am, full stop, without qualification, God, and that's how Jesus existed. And yet, the human soul of Jesus did have a relation, even in grace, to the divinity, but it was a relation that was incomparably greater, infinitely beyond our capacity to imitate, and yet he did have an interior life as a human person.
Okay. And we thank you so much for your call, Patrick. Glad that you're listening to us in Albany. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Recommend that you call now because phones do get clogged up, especially in the last half of the show. We would hate to not get your question on the air. Here's an email that we received. This is an anonymous email, David, from Canada. Hello, I'm sponsoring a Native American boy in Paraguay. He is not Christian, but practices the religion of his tribe. He does not attend a school, or he does attend a school run by nuns. So what is the best way to evangelize him?
Okay, so you're sponsoring him. I assume that means that you're contributing to his financial well-being, maybe paying his tuition, and he's attending the school run by nuns. That seems like a pretty good start to me.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you're bringing this child into the orbit of Catholic religious, and they're on the job, and they're on the ground. And your financial support, Jesus actually talks specifically. He talks specifically about the role of the laity in supporting Catholic ministry. After he gave the command to the disciples to go out and preach the gospel and heal the sick and raise the dead and these kinds of things, he said, anyone who gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones. And in that context, he's really talking about those who've gone out to spread the gospel. Those who would give cups of cold water. Jesus himself was accompanied by a large number of women who had means, and they would contribute to the financial costs of his ministry as he was going around Judea and the Holy Land preaching the gospel and healing the sick. They paid for his daily needs. And he said, you should do the same thing for these folks that I'm sending out. And anyone who gives even a cup of cold water will surely not lose his reward. So the fact that you're sponsoring this child and you're making it possible for the religious sisters to minister to him, Jesus says to you, you will not lose your reward.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your email. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. There's a line available right now for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Matthias is watching us on YouTube right now. Matthias says, under normal circumstances, when, as in at what age, does the Sunday Mass obligation begin for Catholics? Also, why do Catholics bow before the altar?
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the question. So, Code of Canon Law, if memory serves me correct, says that Catholics from the age of 7 are bound by the Sunday obligation. Now, I mean, I tell you, in my practice and many people that I know, we take our small kids to Mass.
Sure.
And we're Catholics, so people get used to the fact that you have squirmy wormies sitting next to you on the pew, and sometimes you have to get up and walk out. And the reason I did that is I said, I had this conversation with my wife years ago, and she asked me one time, she said, well, they don't know what's going on. And I said, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. They can learn the habit of reverence. You can learn the habit of reverence without the words. And we want to teach them Sunday is something special. And I know in my own life, before I was Catholic, grew up Presbyterian, my parents always took me to church every Sunday from a very young age. And I have a very distinct memory as a very young child of the offering plate coming down the pew and my dad reaching into his pocket, did this every Sunday without fail, pulling out a quarter, which that was big money back in those days, pulling out a quarter, putting it in my hand and saying, put this in the offering basket. And you say, well, that wasn't your quarter to give. You better believe it was my quarter to give. He gave it to me, and then I put it in the offering basket. He was teaching me how to be charitable and how to give. And that all happened before the age of 7. I went downhill after 7 in my case. But I got a lot. I learned a lot by the age of 7.
Okay, very good. And thank you so much for checking in with us via YouTube, Matthias. Call to communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN.
Oh, you want to know why Catholics bow in front of the altar?
Yes, he did.
Okay, so 2 very important things happen on the altar. One is that Christ comes down from heaven and is present to us in the Blessed Sacrament, which is consecrated on that altar. So this is a very sacred place. Secondly, the altar is the altar of sacrifice. That's what altar means. And that body and blood of Christ made present for us in the Blessed Sacrament is in turn offered to God the Father in reparation for the sins of the world. So this altar represents the high point, the central moment of Christian worship, and the most sublime act of worship that we can give to Almighty God. And we bow to show reverence to what a sublime mystery is being presented to us in the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass.
Okay. Glad we could answer both those questions for you there, Matthias. Thank you so much for listening to the show. Here's a question from Marie listening in Ghana. This is an email just received here. In a recent episode, a caller asked about how to tell the difference between God's will and the evil one guiding you to another choice. But what do you do in cases where something is morally neutral? For example, going on a road trip or a vacation, but which for some reason feels wrong or maybe feels dangerous or just doesn't feel right. Love your show. Thanks in advance for your response. Marie in Ghana.
Okay, thanks, Marie. I really appreciate the question. So, first of all, conscience, to which we always have an obligation, an unqualified obligation to obey conscience. Conscience is a function of our deliberative reason. It's our practical intellect discerning the prudent or the right course of action in any concrete set of circumstances. So this is not something. It's not an ushy-cushy, funny internal feeling. Conscience. Conscience is not just a flow of the humors. Conscience is a determination of the reason, the practical intellect about the proper thing to be done, based on an understanding of the hierarchy of values that would pertain in any situation. So, for example, if I'm driving down the road and I see somebody who's injured who needs help, and I also see, somebody left a really delicious lunch basket over here on the right. There's nothing wrong with picking up a lunch basket, but the human life is of more value. And I don't need intuition to tell me that. I mean, my reason can see that, and I can judge that is the proper thing to do. I don't have to put up a little Geiger counter, to see where my emotions flow.
Yeah.
And so if there's a genuinely morally indifferent choice, and in the sort of the calculus of moral reasoning, one is not necessarily to be preferred to the other, then there's no reason that I could not follow passion or desire. I mean, if I like oranges better than lemons, I'm permitted to eat oranges. I don't have to eat lemons if I don't want to, unless I have some doctor's order or something saying make sure you get your 3 lemons a day.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's okay. Now, is it ever a good idea to follow the little funny internal feeling? Certainly not as a first line of decision making. I think from time to time you might be in a situation where you get a funny feeling, you have some sort of intuition that this might be dangerous. Somebody says, my dad was in business. I like to talk about my dad. Sorry, this is the second time for the day.
It's okay.
He had pretty good horse sense about who was trying to snow him. and he walked away from business deals and contracts and things if he didn't trust somebody, felt like they're trying to take advantage of him or one of his clients, and that kind of thing. That's reasonable, but that's also you're making a reasoned judgment about the total situation, including your sort of intuitive read of people and things like that. And that's okay. That's okay. But ultimately, conscience is a judgment of the reason, the practical intellect.
Very good. It's called to communion here on EWTN. Glad you could join us for our program today. In a moment, we're going to get to Irina, who's calling from Columbus, Ohio. Also, Ara in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. Beautiful name there. And Whitney in Yukon, Oklahoma. So we're going to get to all those. We also have a couple of lines open with your name on it right now. And that number 833-288 EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Or if you prefer, you can certainly text the letters EWTN to 55000. We would like to hear from you in that way also. Again, the caller is standing by here for the program. Irina in Columbus, listening on St. Gabriel Radio. Ara in Massachusetts, listening on Sirius XM. And Whitney in Oklahoma, listening online at EWTN.com. Call to communion here with Dr. David Anders on EWTN. Do stay with us.
Cresta. The secular press just doesn't get our story. They don't even understand it. And so it's incumbent upon us to get the story straight and get the story out.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
This is Mike and Alicia Hernan with a Messy Family Minute. It's often said that kindness begins at home. But sometimes this is the most challenging place to be kind. Families' days are rushed, and it seems as if parents are just taxi drivers, getting people from place to place. Sometimes we need to pause and make a renewed effort to form our children in kindness.
One of the first ways to instill kindness is by requiring kind behavior, or as we often say, fake it till you make it. When you require and train your young child to act with kindness, very often the heart follows. Begin with the action and you'll be training their heart as well. Another key element is to catch your kids in the act of doing good. Praise their courteous behavior and affirm their identity as a kind and generous person. Often we focus on catching our kids being bad. We need to be just as eager to catch them doing good.
To hear our 7 ways to form your kids in kindness and our complete podcast on this subject, visit us at messyfamilyminute.org.
Now, not only can you watch EWTN anywhere but anytime with EWTN On Demand. Get on-demand access to more than 12,000 EWTN programs, including live shows and specials, all in one place, all free. Just go to EWTN.com/on-demand. There's nothing to fill out, no memberships required, and no fees to pay. All you need is an internet connection, and you're good to go. EWTN On Demand. Fast, easy, and free.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Join us later today on Catholic Answers Live as we do our best to explain and defend the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's called to communion here on EWTN. Looks like we have one line open right now at 833-288-EWTN. Let's go right back to it here for Ara. Ara is listening in Chelmsford, Massachusetts via Sirius XM Channel 130. Ara, what's on your mind today?
Thank you, Dr. Andrews, for taking my call. My question concerns non-Catholics attending a Catholic Mass and receiving Holy Communion. So I'm Armenian Orthodox. Part of the Oriental Orthodox family of churches. And through intermarriage, I've attended a number of Catholic Masses in the past. And there's been a rubric or guidance that the Holy Communion for that Mass was reserved for Catholics. Now, attending a Catholic Mass just recently, I see that restriction had been removed. So my question is, are non-Catholics welcome to receive Holy Communion at a Catholic Mass? And when was this policy changed, if it was?
Yeah, thank you. So some non-Catholics are permitted to receive communion in the Catholic Church, and some are not, okay? Most of the Protestant denominations, their members are not permitted to receive Holy Communion in the Catholic Church. With the Orthodox, it's a different story. And Orthodox Christians are permitted by the Catholic Church to receive communion in the Catholic Church. And the reasoning behind that is that we recognize that the communion between Catholic and Orthodox is far closer. Their ecclesiology is far closer. Their sacramental theology is far closer. And we really have this consciousness that at one time, all of these liturgical families were united in one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And by and large, the faithful are really not the ones that are responsible for the break in communion, right? And
right.
It's really up to the hierarchy to kind of get this stuff figured out. But like we all know that ultimately we really all are one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and we look forward today that when we have a very public recognition of the fact that we all share in this one body of Christ. That's not the case with the Protestant communions that definitively broke away from Catholic teaching and Catholic faith and Catholic sacramental practice. So the sacraments that Orthodox are permitted, they can receive Holy Communion, they can receive absolution and last rites. Obviously, they're not going to receive ordination, marriage, and these things, but they can receive communion. In terms of when was that policy clearly articulated, there are some who know the history of this better than I do. But if my understanding is, I think rather early in American history, at least by the 19th century, when you began to have clearly Catholics were. The church with apostolic succession that had the greatest representation in the American colonies. But in the 19th century, you began to have more Eastern Europeans and Greeks and Russians and others that were moving into the country, and many of them didn't actually have access to their own priests and sacraments. And the Catholic Church felt a great solicitude towards these people and wanted to see that their sacramental needs were met. And that's clearly the case with Eastern Rite Catholics. But the provisions allowing these began to evolve basically at that time. And I'm not an expert in the law of Oriental churches or the canon law on this issue, but it's something that's sort of been developing over time by the 20th century and clearly by the Council. I mean, this is a much more standard practice.
Ara, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Irina in Columbus, Ohio, listening on St. Gabriel Radio. Hey there, what's on your mind today?
Thank you for taking my call. I know that your show is geared towards non-Catholics, but as a cradle Catholic, I've enjoyed listening to your show for the last 4 years.
Thank you.
I don't really have a question. It's more of a comment. I think that I was called to call because you answered that abortion question with such class and intelligence, and I really appreciate that. As a Catholic, as a mother, and as a scientist, I know that life begins at conception, and I just thought that the way you handled that question was so beautiful. I also don't understand why some people are under the misconception that science and Catholicism can't coexist. And so they ask these pseudo-intellectual questions when, their motives, his motives were somewhere else, and actually learning about the issue. So I really appreciate the way you handled that question.
Thank you.
That was my comment.
I really do appreciate. Thank you so much for your kind words. And of course, on the question of the Catholic faith and science, it's very important that people realize, many people don't, of course, that the scientific revolution in the West is largely the fruit of Catholic intellectual history. And most of the groundwork that needed to be done in order for there to be a scientific revolution was carried out by Catholic scholastic theologians and Catholic philosophers. And it's not just the recovery of Aristotle to Western universities, although that was critical, but also explicitly the attempt to reconcile divergent theories of physical science and natural philosophy, and to see how those could fit together in the notion of a contingent universe. The Greeks, most ancient cultures, didn't really have the idea of a contingent universe. Contingent means non-necessary. But Christians, of course, believe that God created the world out of nothing as an act of his own free will. The earth doesn't have to be, right? There's not a necessity to the way things are. God set it up this way. And so that if you follow the logic of that, deductive reasoning, where you start with sort of incontrovertible first principles and work your way down, will only give you so much, because there are certain things about the natural world that are just not deductively obvious, right? But you can only approach them empirically from the ground up, so to speak. You start with an examination of the world that God actually made, and then try to discern the intelligibility of the thing. And so it was actually on that basis that things like the theory of inertia was often credited to Galileo, but it's actually 14th century Catholic thinkers who discovered the principle of inertia on theological rather than just purely empirical grounds.
Wow.
And then the early modern scientists like Galileo and Copernicus and the others were notorious about plagiarizing and very deliberate in not quoting their sources. We're reading in these Catholic scholastic cosmologies, and then they said, well, these are interesting ideas. Let's empirically test them. Oh, they work. All right. All of that groundwork was done by Catholic philosophers and theologians. So good resources on that you might want to explore. The works of Stanley Yockey, who was a Benedictine priest, as well as a PhD in astrophysics, wrote a lot on the history of science and the Church's contribution to the history of science. His book, The Savior of Science, is one. And then there's a good master's thesis that sort of summarizes Yockey's work by Stacy Trasancos, all about Stanley Yockey, Father Yockey, and his contribution to the understanding of the Catholic contribution to the history of science.
Irina, thanks again for your kind words about the show. We really do appreciate it. Call to Communion here on EWTN. I want to get to a tough question here. This is from Mark, who is watching us right now via Facebook. Mark says, some 50 years ago, I pressured my girlfriend to have an abortion she did not want. I have carried guilt and deep sadness ever since. Although I have confessed that since and have received absolution, and I know that God has forgiven me, but I have not ever really forgiven myself. My life since then has been an act of penitence. So how do I release, finally, that sadness and guilt?
Okay, I appreciate the question a lot, and I'm so sorry. And our heart goes out to you with this, because this is obviously, this would be a source of great suffering to you.
50 years.
Yeah, that's really awful. Okay. I've got a couple thoughts. First of all, remember Jesus Christ himself said, "Blessed are those who mourn." And so it's not inappropriate for you, when you consider the loss of a human life, whatever the circumstances, to mourn and to recognize that as an evil and something that calls for your compassion and empathy and maybe your remorse, right? That's not an objectively bad thing. In fact, it might be a source of blessing in your life, even in a very sort of paradoxical way. After you've come to repentance and realize it can be a motive for you going forward to reform your life and seek virtue and cherish others. And so all those things can be good things, that God can allow good to come even out of evil. So blessed are those who mourn. Don't forget that. Secondly, I would suggest that, when you know objectively that your sins are forgiven, that you've been reconciled to God, and you're okay, like you're moving forward on the right path. Mm-hmm. There's an unhealthy sort of self-preoccupation in guilt that can come as really a temptation against the life of virtue. I myself am deeply familiar with this temptation, and I'm empathetic to your plight. We can become so down on ourselves and think, what a bad guy I am, and how can I ever do differently? And, if only I could go back and, Father Emmerich says we have to give up the hope for a better past. That's a great piece of advice.
Yeah.
But this temptation to despair or to sloth in the spiritual life out of despair and thinking we can't ever do anything about it, the ancients had a word for that. They called it exadia. It was one of the evil thoughts. If you remember the 7 deadly sins, the one that's identified as sloth, we think of sloth as just, I don't want to get off the couch, I'm eating my burrito, But it's more than that. It's a kind of spiritual lassitude born of despair and a lack of hope that really drags us down. And the Desert Fathers were really familiar with this. Guys like Evagrius Ponticus wrote about the logos moi, this Greek word that means these evil thoughts and temptations that drag us down. And he actually, Ponticus, Evagrius, prescribed techniques that would be very similar to what you would find in modern cognitive behavioral therapy, right? That we have to take steps to avoid what one psychologist told me one time we call stinking thinking, because your emotions will often, not always, but they'll often follow your thoughts.
Uh-huh.
And what the fathers of the church counseled, and look, these guys are direct antecedents to modern psychotherapists. What they counseled was attend to your thoughts. Be aware of, when you catch yourself going down that negative path of stinking thinking and catastrophizing and self-blame, you do something to snap yourself out of it. And literally, I had one therapist tell me, put a rubber band around your wrist. Literally, snap yourself out of it. And you counter it with positive thoughts, affirmations that you can articulate to. That's exactly what the Desert Father said. That's what Evagrius Ponticus said to do in his book, The Practicus, which is a counsel on how to defeat these evil thoughts. And so you can repeat to yourself, that's a lie. I know I'm forgiven. I'm a child of God. I'm heading on the right path. I'm not going to let myself give myself, the devil's been telling me that I deserve to feel this way, all right? But God says I'm a child of God, reborn, like Zacchaeus. Today salvation has come to this house. I'm going to affirm that to myself, and I'm going to believe true things about my identity as a child of God and move forward. So use those techniques of attending to your thoughts, turning your thoughts to things above, to what God says about you, so that you're not lost in that exadia, that despair, that lack of hope that would drag you away from the spiritual life and from good things.
Hope that's helpful for you, Mark. God bless you, sir, and thanks so much for your question. It is Call to Communion here on EWTN. We're now on the radio side somewhere north of 350 radio stations across the United States, and if you're looking around the world, over 500 stations. Do you have a Catholic radio station close by to you, like an AM or an FM station? You know what? God just might be calling you to start a Catholic radio station, and it is doable. You can find out how you can start up a Catholic radio station right there where you live. Contact Jack Williams. Here's his email address, jwilliams@ewtn.com, jwilliams@ewtn.com. All right, back to the phones now here on Call to Communion. Let's go to Whitney in Yukon, Oklahoma, listening online, ewtn.com. Hey there, Whitney. What's on your mind today?
Hi. My husband has grown attracted to attending the Latin traditional Mass. And I like the idea of it, except for there's more differences than I expected. For instance, on Second Sunday of Advent, they had different readings. And I just was wondering if there was any resources you had that I could read, because I have so many more questions about the differences and why they're allowed and why the changes were made. Anything along those lines would be great.
Okay.
Yes. So the first book that comes to my mind is not precisely on point to your question. I apologize, but it's when I talk to my sort of Latin Massy friends about what are your favorite books on liturgy, all right? Everybody points to Cardinal Ratzinger's book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, which really gets into the whole question of what the liturgy is and how it's to be understood, and it also provides a framework for understanding the reforms of the mid-20th century. Now, you're correct. There's a different lectionary, there are different prayers. There a lot of changes were made in the Mass after the Council. The biggest one, Sacrosanctum Concilium. I should tell you to read that as well, which is the Constitution from the Second Vatican Council on the sacred liturgy. You need to read that and get your head wrapped around what it actually says as a motive for reform. Now, a couple things to be noted. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, the notion of the active participation of the faithful is really what comes to the forefront. What does that mean, and why was it a value? In the traditional Mass, in the Latin Mass, there are no rubrics for the faithful. The rubrics, those are the instructions about how the Mass is to be celebrated. The rubrics all pertain to the actions and the prayers of the priest, with a consciousness, and an appropriate one, that the priest is the one who effects the sacrifice. And so his role is principal, and that is as it should be. Now, from the 16th century, with the promulgation of the Tridentine Rite, the participation of the laity is by attending. You would often hear in the old language, they would say, well, go hear Mass. Go hear the Mass. The priest says the Mass, you go hear the Mass. But in terms of what you would do when you were there, was really kind of up to you. So some people might carry a missalette with them and read along, whether in Latin or in their vernacular translation. Other people might take the rosary or their devotional books or make their private prayers, because their consciousness of their participation was, the priest is offering the sacrifice, I'm joining my prayers and offerings to his sacrifice, right? And that was the extent of the connection, theologically speaking. And whether or not I pray the responses, for example, is not really ultimately relevant in terms of the efficacy of the Mass or its sacrifice. I'm just going to bring my prayers and works and joys and sufferings and sorrows, whatever those might be, join them to the priest's offering, and there you go. That's how the thing works. Well, because of that dynamic, which had, many commendable aspects to it, many people felt like they didn't know how to do that. They didn't know how to connect to the Mass. They weren't sure how to appropriate the spiritual riches of the sublime sacrifice. And so from the 19th century, there was a liturgical movement aimed at bringing the lay people into a more informed participation of the liturgy. And that was a value that was articulated long before the Council. And it's one that early 20th century popes embraced and endorsed. And so the Council Fathers said, we really need to make that paramount, that idea of how do we bring the faithful into an informed participation in Mass. Now, one of the abuses, if you will, one of the malformations of that principle, some people thought participation of the faithful means that they get up and run around the altar and do things. And that's not what it meant. No. What it meant is that they have an understanding of the sacred rites in which they're participants. And Sacrosanctum Concilium, that constitution, points out what is always standard Orthodox Catholic truth: the priest effects the sacrifice, but the whole church offers it. The holy sacrifice of the Mass is offered by the entire church, effected by the priest, offered by the whole church. That's why you hear the priest say, in the ordinary form, "Pray, my brethren, that my sacrifice and yours."
Yes.
Right. And so that goes into part of the reason why the liturgy was changed as it was. Now, in the Council Fathers did not anticipate the changes that actually happened. Right. Those came out of the Sacred Congregation for Divine Liturgy, Divine Worship, and sort of happened after the Council. But in terms of bringing in that note of active participation, that was the key difference.
Okay, very good. And Whitney, thank you so much for your call today here on Call to Communion. Let's go right now to Jenny in St. Louis, listening on Sirius XM 130, a first-time caller. Hello, Jenny. What's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you. I love your show. I was hoping you could help me understand something about the Last Judgment. I understand that there are two. That first we are judged at the moment of our death, but then the second one, when Christ will judge the living and the dead. And so my question was about that second, more public judgment and why that was necessary.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the question. So when my children were in school and in athletics, swim team, wrestling team, whatever, you knew who won the match as soon as the match was over. As soon as the event was done on the swim team, you knew who came in first. And the referees there with their time clocks or whatever, and they went, click, you win. And so mom and dad were happy, all right? But at the end of the swim meet, or the end of the wrestling match, or the end of the Olympics, whatever it is, what do? Well, you take the winners, and you put them up on a pedestal, and you hand them a ribbon, and everybody claps, right? Yeah. And the losers go home crying, right? That's the way it works. It's the same thing with God's judgment. At the end of your life, you receive the verdict, so to speak, and you know instantly where you're going. You're going to heaven, hell, or purgatory, and that's how it works. But at the second coming of Christ, you get your body back. You don't have your body for a while. You miss it. You want to get it back. You get it back at the end of time, and then God hands you the ribbon, so to speak. You get publicly, if you're one of the elect, if you're one of the righteous, you're publicly vindicated in the very same sphere in which you were once dishonored for being a follower of Jesus. So you think about the martyrs, for example. That's really easy to see in their case. They were thrown into the arena. They were mocked. They were tortured. They were ridiculed in a public way. Now, when they died, they went straight to heaven, so they don't mind. But at the second coming of Christ, they'll be vindicated before the very same people that cast them into prison and tortured them and sicked the lions on them. And that's part of the reward of the just. And it's also part of the display of God's glory, that he takes care of his own. He vindicates his children, and the punishment of the wicked is manifest. You know, we grieve so much over the injustices, particularly the wars and the cataclysms of the 20th century. And we think, how could this tyrant or that tyrant who killed so many millions of people, you know, and then offs himself in a bunker, you know, there seems to be no justice in the world. Well, God says, well, do I have a surprise for you, right? There is justice in the world, and all the world will see it. That's the point of the final judgment. All the world will see it.
Okay. Thank you so much for your call, Jenny. We'll get to as many calls as we can on this edition of Call to Communion. Here is Teresa now in Lyons, Nebraska, listening on the Great Spirit Catholic Radio. Hey there, what's on your mind today?
I wanted to ask Dr. Anders, why do people make the sign of the cross after they receive Holy Communion?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the question. So, making the sign of the cross after Holy Communion is not indicated in the rubrics, meaning that you're not required to do it. And if you fail to do it, you haven't missed out on something essential. I will tell you why I personally do this, right?
All right.
I make the sign of the cross like all the time. I do it all the time. I do it sometimes getting in and out of the car. I do it if I have a wayward thought. I do it if I'm upset. I do it if I'm happy. Because, look, it's speaking sign language to God. That's what it is. And sometimes I want to connect in prayer to God, but I don't have words for the occasion. And I make the sign of the cross, which is just sign language to God. When I go to Holy Communion, I feel an intense gratitude for the privilege. And many times I don't particularly want to offer an articulate prayer in words, but I do wish to indicate by some gesture my gratitude and appreciation to God for the Blessed Sacrament. It seems to me that the sign of the cross is a very appropriate way to do that. But you don't have to do what I do. It's not required by the rubrics.
All right. Teresa, thank you so much for your call. Real quick, let's go to Cindy in Pennsylvania. Cindy, we have about a minute. What's on your mind today?
I just want to thank Dr. Anders for everything he does, and to let him know that even as a cradle Catholic, I listen to you on the radio, I watch you on TV, and I'm learning so much. They don't have the time to teach us the things that you are teaching us. So I want to thank you on behalf of the cradle Catholics. I really don't have a question.
I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that. That means the world to me. It really, really does. You know, when I went to the priest and told him I wanted to become a Catholic, he looked at me and he said, well, either you're marrying a Catholic or you read your way in. Because that's true of like 99% of converts.
Sure.
It's one of the two. And I said, option B. I read my way in. And I did. You know, I read for years and years and years and years and years, full time, really, as a theology student. And I was a really hard case. You know, I had to spend about 10 years at it, reading my way into the church. And I learned a lot of stuff. And it's the greatest privilege of my life that is not just in service to my own conversion to the Catholic faith, but that I get to turn around and share with other people the reasons that made me Catholic. And that's why we have what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Odds are it was stopping me once too.
Sure.
And I love to be able to share with people how God brought me through those hurdles, and maybe I can help them too. So thank you so much.
Cindy, we've been doing this show for, I think, 6 years now, David?
Yeah.
And I'm still learning every day on this program, even though some questions come and go, and we know that we're going to get a lot of repeats, but I learn something every day. So thank you so much for your kind words about the show. Hey, Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Don't forget, we do the program right here on EWTN, Monday through Friday on the radio side at 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern and a best-of show Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thanks for joining us this time and every time here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.